Stop the celebrations right now. Look around at the news, and you are seeing a parade of delusions. Champagne corks popping in Tehran, global stock markets rallying, oil prices taking a massive nosedive, and Pakistan's prime minister taking a premature victory lap. Donald Trump is currently flooding social media with declarations that we finally secured a historic deal and a lasting moment of peace. I need you to pause, take a hard breath, and snap out of it. Ask yourself one brutally honest question. When in the history of the last 100 years has a flimsy, 14-day pause between two massive powers who both genuinely believe they won the fight ever actually ended a war? Consider the reality of a 2-week ceasefire. It is not a surrender. It is not a binding peace treaty. And it is absolutely not a negotiated settlement backed by international guarantors with real enforcement rules. 2 weeks is not peace. It is simply two battered armies retreating to their corners to wipe the blood off their faces and catch their breath before the bell rings again. If you blindly trust these euphoric headlines and let celebratory ignorance replace objective analysis, the impending fallout is going to completely blindside you. Based purely on the historical structure and the ruthless game theory logic of every single player on this board, what is coming next is not peace. We are merely entering the second phase of a massive conflict that never actually stopped. Let's look at the basic, undeniable facts on the ground. Literally hours after this so-called historic ceasefire was announced to the world, Israel was heavily bombarding Beirut. This wasn't a cautious or restrained operation. Israel unleashed what Lebanese authorities are officially calling the single most devastating assault on their soil since this entire war kicked off. Over 250 people were slaughtered in a single morning, with dense neighborhoods in central Beirut taking direct hits right during the morning rush hour, while civilians scrambled through the smoke. Benjamin Netanyahu's government didn't stutter. They made it crystal clear that any ceasefire signed with Iran absolutely does not apply to their military campaign in Lebanon. It does not apply to the Lebanese state, and it certainly does not apply to Hezbollah. Here's your glaring structural nightmare. The United States and Iran shook hands on a pause. Pakistan took credit for brokering it, and the globe applauded. Meanwhile, Iran's most vital regional asset, Hezbollah, is actively being turned into ash and rubble in the immediate aftermath of that exact agreement. In response, Iran's Supreme National Security Council didn't issue a message of harmony. They explicitly stated that their hands are on the trigger. They promised that if the enemy makes even the slightest miscalculation, it will be met with absolute full force. I promise you, that is not the diplomatic vocabulary of a regime that thinks the war is over. That is the calculated language of a military power that is pausing, aggressively regrouping, and waiting in the shadows. Why on earth would Iran strategically honor a truce while Israel systematically dismantles its most crucial regional ally? From a strict game theory perspective, there is zero incentive to do so. Iran spent 40 years meticulously building a formidable deterrent system, a vast web of regional militias, proxy fighters, missile stockpiles, and deep influence operations. And it is currently being torn apart piece by piece while Tehran's diplomats sit idle at a negotiating table. Every single day this artificial ceasefire holds while Israel keeps dropping bombs in Lebanon, Iran loses precious leverage for the final negotiations. The leadership in Tehran are not fools. They completely understand this brutal mathematical reality. Now flip the board and look at the American side, because the dysfunction here is spectacular. J.D. Vance hit the television circus to smugly declare that America is in a good spot. He threatened that if Iran violates the agreement, they will face dire consequences. And he proudly noted that Tehran is finally reopening the Strait of Hormuz. Fine. But in the very same breath, Vance casually admitted a terrifying detail. He confessed that there are 3 completely different sets of 10-point proposals floating around. There is massive systemic confusion about which document even serves as the foundation for these peace talks. You literally have Trump ranting on social media that fake terms are being leaked by individuals who aren't even involved in the diplomacy. The White House press secretary couldn't even clearly articulate what the agreed framework of the deal actually entailed. Understand this. We are not dealing with a signed treaty or even a basic memorandum of understanding. We are dealing with a verbal handshake between two paranoid governments that inherently despise each other. It was mediated by a third-party Pakistani government where the sitting prime minister and the political opposition can't even agree on what was negotiated. The contradictions are staggering. Iranians insist the ceasefire protects Lebanon, while Israelis flat out reject that. Washington claims the diplomatic talks are going swimmingly, yet Iran's own parliament insists they haven't received a shred of official information about the ongoing negotiations. These are not the foundational building blocks for a lasting peace. They are the exact ingredients for a catastrophic global miscalculation. Let's dig into the core structural interests driving each actor, because structure, not hopeful rhetoric or optimism, is what actually dictates how this ends. Start with Iran. What did they actually gain from this war? They suffered massive blows. Supreme Leader Khamenei was assassinated on February 28th, the very first day of the conflict. They lost one of their most brilliant diplomatic operators, Ali Larijani. Their critical nuclear facilities were devastated by American bombers in a strike that severely crippled their strategic capabilities. Despite all this, Iran's Supreme National Security Council is broadcasting to the world that they have successfully achieved nearly all of their wartime objectives. You have to read between the lines. Either the regime is brazenly lying to its citizens, which history proves is entirely possible, or their definition of victory fundamentally differs from ours. For Tehran, victory doesn't mean defeating the American military. Victory means surviving it. They absorbed the most devastating Western military onslaught since the invasion of Iraq, and the regime is still standing. That is the precise message they are beaming to every Houthi commander, every Hezbollah fighter, and every Iraqi militia leader in their network. We took the ultimate hit, and we are still here. In the Middle East, that narrative of survival is strategically worth infinitely more than any broken nuclear centrifuge. Then you have Israel. Netanyahu is aggressively continuing the destruction of Hezbollah in Lebanon because he explicitly stated the ceasefire doesn't apply there. Yet, domestic rivals like Yair Lapid are publicly branding this ceasefire as the most catastrophic political disaster in the history of Israel. Why the outrage? Because Israeli hardliners felt the end was near. They desperately wanted this conflict to trigger the complete collapse of the Islamic Republic and force regime change in Tehran. A premature ceasefire that leaves the Iranian government fully intact, emboldened, and publicly claiming victory is their worst possible outcome. Israel has been put in a suffocating position where its primary patron, the United States, slammed the brakes on the war right before Israel could achieve its ultimate strategic goals. That underlying tension between Washington and Jerusalem isn't fading. It is guaranteed to escalate. And finally, look at America. Donald Trump is obsessed with the spectacle of the deal. His psychological approach to military action isn't rooted in traditional grand strategy. It's pure theatrical performance. He craved the cinematic visual of bombing Iran's nuclear sites, which he dramatically dubbed Operation Midnight Hammer. He got his fiery television moment, and now he is pivoting to demand the grand spectacle of diplomacy. He wants the historic handshake and the unparalleled bragging rights to claim that he alone achieved the impossible. But the reality is a mess. The talks kicking off in Islamabad are built on a phantom framework nobody can define. Iran's foreign minister is currently jetting off to Paris, Berlin, and London to court the Europeans. Trump is left trying to negotiate the actual terms via social media clarifications. And while the Strait of Hormuz, the absolute most critical choke point for the global oil supply, is technically reopening, it's hanging by a thread. Oil prices dropped today on pure, unadulterated hope, but they can violently spike again tomorrow when reality sets back in. The merciless logic of game theory points to one brutal, uncomfortable truth. This ceasefire wasn't signed because both sides realized the war was unwinnable. It was signed because both adversaries desperately needed a timeout for completely different, entirely selfish reasons. Iran needed a window to evaluate the ruins of its nuclear program, consolidate its narrative of regime survival, reestablish communications with its battered proxy network, and approach the negotiating table as a defiant survivor rather than a collapsed state. The United States needed the pause because Trump's military campaign successfully hit its kinetic milestones, wrecking the nuclear facilities, but fundamentally failed its political objective of altering Iran's core behavior. The inevitable next steps to achieve that, a full-scale ground invasion or a permanent blockade, are absolutely not operations the U.S. military is prepared to execute or the American public is willing to stomach. So structurally, we have two heavily armed powers, both convinced they hold the leverage, sitting down to finalize a deal that neither of them likely intends to fully honor. Hardline factions in Iran, kept entirely in the dark by their own parliament, are actively demanding the assassination of Trump, and the concept of nuclear disarmament is so vaguely defined that even the direct negotiators can't agree on its meaning. Meanwhile, America's closest ally, Israel, is conducting active military operations that hand Tehran the perfect, justified excuse to completely shatter the ceasefire whenever they choose. History does not carve ceasefire announcements into stone. It remembers the carnage that follows. Every single historical precedent screams that when the foundational structural conditions for war are left untouched, when deep-seated grievances fester, when domestic politics demand escalation, when regional proxies are still actively slaughtering each other, and when economic weapons are still deployed, the pause is never the end. It is merely the intermission before the real bloodshed begins. So watch the upcoming Friday talks in Islamabad like a hawk. Don't listen to the PR statements. Listen for what is deliberately left unsaid. Watch to see if they conveniently delay the highly explosive question of nuclear enrichment, which is exactly what torpedoed the February negotiations. Watch if American pressure can successfully leash Israel's military in Lebanon, or if the bombing continues. Watch if the hardliners in Tehran's parliament inevitably invent a reason to accuse the Americans of breaking the pact. And keep a close eye on the Strait of Hormuz. It will open temporarily just so Iran can feign compliance, but watch the specific conditions under which they reserve the right to slam it shut again. 14 days isn't nearly enough time to unravel 45 years of deeply entrenched warfare and systemic hatred. It is barely enough time to dig the graves for the dead, leaving us with the terrifying realization of just how deafening the next phase will be when this fleeting illusion inevitably shatters.